Hey guys, Mike here. In this video, I'm going to explain why the General is the best class in Fire Emblem Engage. And I've been thinking about this for a long time, even without even playing the game. And the reason I think the General is the best class out of all the classes in the game is because of the value added per turn. So one turn is basically one player phase and one enemy phase. And the value is what that unit contributes on that player phase and on that enemy phase. And I've sort of summarized the value or possible points of value as damage, mitigation, and healing. Okay, so damage should be pretty obvious. It's just the amount of damage you do either on player phase or on enemy phase. Attacking units, if you play on player phase a lot, then you may think you're getting a lot of value from damage on player phase, but the thing is you can only attack once on player phase, right? So actually a lot more damage is actually coming on enemy phase, especially if you play on enemy phase. Damage, that one's pretty obvious. So next is mitigation. Now mitigation is how much damage you absorb from the enemy, right? So mitigation is sort of how much of that enemy attack does not go through, right? Okay, so for example, there's two forms of mitigation in Fire Emblem. And the first form of mitigation is pretty obvious. It's defense. So if you have a high defense, then the amount of attack that the enemy does to you is just totally nullified, right? Especially if your defense is higher than the enemy's attack. Another form of mitigation that you may be familiar with is avoid, right? So if you dodge all the enemy's attacks, then that's effectively, you're completely nullifying that enemy's attack from a different point of view, but it's more from a chance point of view, right? It's not guaranteed that you'll dodge the attack, right? And if you have crappy speed, then you're most likely going to get hit. So it's not a very strong form if you have low speed. Now, if you have high speed and your speed is guaranteed to dodge, then yeah, of course, it's sort of like a really high defense where you have complete mitigation of the enemy's attack. And so it really depends on the breakpoints and the actual value of that speed and that defense, right? Now, one point I want to make is that this is from the perspective of maddening, and I think in normal mode, speed is probably the best. That because just like the enemies are not challenging at all, so it's really easy to hit speed thresholds, completely dodge the enemy's attacks. But I think on maddening, it's a much more nuanced and a much more, you have to think about it a bit more, right? You can't just rely on speed. Defense is actually pretty relevant on maddening, because defense is more, the variance in the results is going to be much more heightened, whereas the variance in the speed results, you can get wildly different results, or you can either get super unlucky and get hit all the time, which is the worst case scenario, or you can get really lucky and you can dodge all the attacks, and you may think you're doing good, but you're actually just getting lucky, right? So mitigation is a form of just how much damage you're rejecting from the enemy. Right? And that's in the form of defense and speed. All right, the next is healing. So healing, this is the reason why healers are the worst units in Fire Emblem Engage, or it shouldn't be like a high priority for your units, because you can only heal one unit per turn, typically. There are skills that enable like defuse healing that allow you to heal multiple units, and it's actually not that much, but it is something to consider for the developers in the future to have healers be able to heal more than one unit per turn. That's one way to buff the High Priest, in my opinion, which is the weakest unit in Fire Emblem Engage. But healing is a contribution to the army, but it is somewhat capped, right? You can only heal one unit per turn, and if you overheal, then you're not getting that much value out of your healer. But nonetheless, it is still value added per turn, right? And it's also nice, to have a unit that can heal as sort of like a side role, because, it just adds total value for that unit over the whole playthrough, right? All right. So you can either multiply them or add them. It doesn't really matter, but it's just basically the sum or the product of the damage, the total damage, the mitigation, and healing that the unit provides per turn. Now, how does this relate to the General? Okay, so the General, on average, because it's a strategy. Okay, so the General has the highest mitigation out of all the units, even higher than the speedsters, right? So on player phase, the general actually has very good strength as well. So the damage is very comparable to other high damaging units. Maybe it's not the best, but it's still nothing to sneeze at. And combined with the fact that generals wield axes, or you can have them wield other weapons if you really want them to, but if you want them to do the most damage, you have them wield axes, and then you have put emblems on the axes that will fix up their hit values. Right? So their damage is very, very significant and comparable to all the other higher damaging classes in the game. And healing is non-existent, but like for other DPS units or damaging units, healing is not really a factor here, so you can kind of ignore healing. So that brings the deciding factor, and that's the mitigation. The mitigation that the general provides is insane. A general can play on enemy phase, and because they have such high defense, they can nullify so much damage and nullify it so reliably, right? Because what you see is what you get. Like, you're not rolling or gambling on anything. If you know your general has high enough defense, then you can strategically always put them on the front line to absorb the damage, or at least bait and aggro the enemies to nullify the damage that they would have done on that enemy phase. So, if they attack you and they do 1 to 2 damage, that's all accounted for, it's all calculated, and you strategize around that. And if they don't attack you, it's not the end of the world, because you are effectively mitigating any potential attacks that the enemies would have done to you, right? Because if you put a DPS unit or a squishy unit in front to take an enemy phase attack that doesn't have high mitigation, then they're going to, this is essentially a negative value, because they're taking damage, right? And you have to spend turns in the future actually healing them up, and that's costing you, right? So even though the general can aggro the units, and even if they don't attack them, it's not the end of the world, because he's still somewhat mitigating the potential damage that you would have taken. Whereas if you put a squishy unit in front, they are getting negative mitigation, right? And you have to heal them on the next turn. And this mitigation here, if they take like chip damage from many units, like maybe even 5 to 6 units, that's like 5 to 6 times like 20 to 30 of attack power that they're mitigating. That's a lot of value they're already adding on turn, and they don't even have to attack back. And you see how much value that they're adding just by being a tank and mitigating all that damage. And the thing is, if they take those attacks, they can also contribute damage as well. If they don't straight out kill them, they will still do significant damage with a Silver Great Axe. I assure you, a Silver Great Axe with an emblem that patches up their hit will do significant damage, and it also just contributes to their total value added per turn. So, like I've said, I've been thinking about this a really long time, even though I even haven't been playing the game. And it's without a question, like, the general is the best unit in the whole game, just because of the sheer damage and mitigation that they provide. Now, some people may say, well, speedsters, they can just dodge, right? I would say on normal mode, yeah, they're pretty good, because the mitigation is extremely reliable on normal mode, because the thresholds are so low, and the bar to meet those thresholds are so low that it's comparable to a general. But a general can work just as well on normal mode as well. So, but the thing is, on maddening, in a strategy game, which is what Fire Emblem is, you don't want to strategize around percentage chances of living or dying, especially if you're trying to get everyone to survive, right? That's not good. That's just playing bad. Whereas if you use a general where all the defense, the attack minus defense, is calculated ahead of time, the unit won't die. Your general won't die if you put him in range. And even if he gets crit, he won't die, because like if he takes 1 damage without a crit, but then he gets crit, then he'll take 3 damage. It's like, he still won't die, even if a general gets crit. So you can easily strategize around it. So the two facts that the general provides the highest value added per turn using this simple equation, combined with the fact that you're not gambling, and it's all, you can always strategize around the total damage that they're going to take on any possible enemy phase, makes the general, in my opinion, the best unit in Fire Emblem game for any strategist who is looking to play the game at an extremely high level. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed that video, and thanks for watching.